If you were adopted in the United States before 1990, there is a document in a government filing cabinet that records the exact moment you were born. It lists the hospital, the time, the names of your biological parents. You are not allowed to see it. What you are given instead is a replacement document, an amended birth certificate that names your adoptive parents as if they were present at your birth, erases the hospital where you were actually born, and in some states changes the city entirely. A document that any private citizen who created it would be prosecuted for falsifying. The government created it, on your behalf, before you were old enough to object. I spent weeks going through the history of how this happened. Not summaries, not op-eds, the actual legislative records, the court filings, the institutional archives, the testimony of the people it was done to. What those records show is a system so deliberately constructed and so consistently defended that calling it a privacy protection requires ignoring almost everything we know about how it actually operated. The records prove it. Here is where I need you to start. Between 1945 and 1973, an estimated 4 million mothers in the United States surrendered children for adoption. 2 million of those surrenders happened in the 1960s alone. This period has a name among researchers. They call it the baby scoop era. 4 million. I need you to understand how large that number is. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services estimates that in 2003, 30 years after the baby scoop era ended, only 14,000 infants were voluntarily surrendered for domestic adoption in the entire country. The era was not a natural response to social conditions. It was an aberration. Something produced the numbers. Something organized them, and whatever organized them also built the system that sealed the records afterward. The vast majority of the 4 million were not poor, they were not addicted, they were not incapable of raising a child. They were young, unmarried, and pregnant in an era that treated that combination as a moral emergency. The social machinery deployed against them was thorough. Many were sent to maternity homes in other cities, away from family, specifically so no one who knew them would witness the pregnancy. Their mail was read, their visitors were controlled. After birth, they were told by social workers, doctors, and clergy to go home and behave as if the child had never existed. In most cases, adoption was not presented as one option among several. It was presented as the only option. One social work researcher writing at the time put it plainly: the large majority of unmarried mothers were better off being permanently separated from their newborns. The separation was considered therapeutic. The shame was considered the point. What followed was 4 million sealed files, 4 million people who grew into adults with no legal right to access records about themselves. 4 million families held apart by paperwork, told the separation was for their protection. And those records are still sealed. Sealed adoption records are not an ancient policy, they are a 20th century invention. And they were invented for reasons that have almost nothing to do with the people they affected most. In 1917, Minnesota became the first state to pass a law sealing adoption records. The stated purpose was not to protect adoptees, it was to protect adoptive families from embarrassment, specifically to prevent anyone from discovering that the child they had taken in was born illegitimate. At the time, birth certificates were marked with the words legitimate or illegitimate. That label was a social death sentence. Adoptive families, who often had standing in their communities, wanted no trace of that stigma attached to their household. The child's interests were not in the calculation. In 1931, 2 registrars of vital statistics proposed the amended birth certificate, the replacement document. By the end of World War II, most states had adopted it. And here is the critical detail that almost never gets mentioned. The original statutes, the ones from the 1930s and 1940s, did not seal records from the adoptee. They sealed records from the public. Adult adoptees could still access their original birth certificates in many states. It was considered self-evidently obvious that a person had the right to know the facts of their own birth. That changed. Between 1960 and 1990, virtually every state that had left adoptee access intact moved to close it. In 1960, approximately 40% of states still allowed adult adoptees to inspect their original birth certificates. By 1990, only 2 states, Kansas and Alaska, allowed it unconditionally. I can already hear the argument. Laws evolved, society changes. Maybe the closures reflected a more sophisticated understanding of privacy. That explanation does not survive contact with the timeline. What changed between 1960 and 1990 was not new research suggesting secrecy protected adoptees. What changed was that adoptees started organizing, they started searching, they started demanding access, and the louder they asked, the tighter the locks got. When the people the system was supposed to protect started asking to see what was in the files, the response was to seal the files harder. That is not a privacy policy, that is a containment strategy. By the early 1970s, adoptees had begun to organize formally. In 1972, a woman named Florence Fisher founded the Adoptees Liberty Mediation Association in New York. Search groups multiplied across the country. Adoptees were locating biological relatives through private investigators, through informal networks, through methods that operated outside the law because the law gave them no option. The legislative response was to restrict access further. The opposition to open records came from adoption agencies who feared liability for what their records contained. It came from some adoptive parent organizations who felt threatened by biological family contact. And it came from a lobbying group called the National Council for Adoption, which campaigned aggressively for sealed records under a new justification: birth mother privacy. That argument did not hold up. The original sealing laws contained no reference to birth mother privacy. None. The argument was constructed retroactively, after the previous justifications had become indefensible, to provide new cover for a policy that had been built for different purposes. Researchers who went back through the legislative records found that birth mothers were rarely consulted when those laws were passed. Many of the birth mothers who were found and asked said they had spent years hoping their children would find them. One researcher summarized it this way: sealed records foster shame. Things which are shameful are kept hidden. And as adoptees became less willing to remain silent, and as shame became a less effective weapon, the restrictions became more strict. The system was designed to erase the connection. When the connection tried to reassert itself, the system tightened. What happened in the United States was a version of something happening simultaneously across the English-speaking world. Nowhere was the machinery more complete or more deliberately concealed than in Ireland. Between 1922 and 1996, more than 10,000 women and girls were imprisoned in Ireland's Magdalene Laundries, church-run institutions where unmarried mothers and women deemed morally irregular were made to perform unpaid labor in silence, cut off from the outside world. The last one closed in 1996, not 1896, not 1946, 1996. I need you to sit with that date for a moment. Connected to the Magdalene system was a network of mother and baby homes, institutions where women gave birth before being forced to relinquish their children. In 2014, researchers discovered a mass grave at the Bon Secours Mother and Baby Home in Tuam, County Galway. Remains of up to 800 infants and children were found in what had been an underground sewage chamber on the property. The institution had been run by a Catholic religious order. It had received state funding. It had state oversight. No one had reported it. From the 1940s onward, Irish babies were exported for adoption, many of them to the United States. More than 2,000 children were sent from Irish mother and baby homes to American families in transactions that one researcher described plainly: baby trafficking organized by nuns, sanctioned by an archbishop, administered by civil servants, approved by politicians who tried to keep it secret. For most of the 20th century, a person born in Ireland to an unmarried mother had no legal right to know their name at birth, no right to know the name of their biological parent, no right to know the hospital where they were born. The 2021 government report into the mother and baby homes was supposed to address this. Survivors called it a whitewash. The commission concluded there was little evidence of forced adoption, while simultaneously acknowledging that women had no choice but to enter the homes and no alternative but to give up their children. Think about what that means. The same report that acknowledged women had no alternative concluded there was little evidence of coercion. Those two conclusions cannot both be true, but both are in the official record, and the religious orders who ran these institutions have never been required to turn over their complete files. In Australia, the same period produced two parallel systems of erasure that operated simultaneously and have never been fully accounted for. The first mirrored the baby scoop era. Between the 1950s and 1970s, Australian hospitals and adoption agencies systematically separated unmarried mothers from their newborns. Babies were taken immediately after birth, sometimes before mothers had regained consciousness. Doctors told women their babies had died when they had not. Adoption papers were obtained from women who were sedated or who had just delivered and were not capable of understanding what they were signing. In some cases, consent was never obtained at all. The Australian Senate investigated these practices in 2012. They found that babies were taken illegally by doctors, nurses, social workers, and religious figures. The government issued a formal apology. The records from those institutions are still inconsistently accessible. The second system was more overtly racial. From approximately 1905 through the 1970s, and in some regions beyond, the Australian government operated a formal policy of forcibly removing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families. These children became known as the stolen generations. Official estimates indicate that between 1 in 10 and 1 in 3 Indigenous children were removed from their families during the period of active policy. Some families had children removed across 3 consecutive generations. The justification offered at the time was protection. The government believed or claimed to believe that Aboriginal culture was dying and that it was therefore an act of mercy to place mixed-race children with white families. What the National Inquiry concluded in 1997 was that these policies constituted genocide. Children were given new names, forbidden from speaking their languages, punished for practicing their cultural traditions. Many were told their parents were dead. Many parents were told their children had been taken somewhere that could not be named. In 2008, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd delivered a formal national apology. No compensation scheme accompanied it. The records relating to individual removals are held across government agencies, church archives, and welfare bodies with inconsistent retention policies and inconsistent access rules. Many people who have spent years searching for information about themselves have found the systems are not designed to help them find it. 4 countries, 4 systems, 1 pattern. The child was taken. The record was sealed. The justification changed whenever the previous one became indefensible. In November 1998, voters in Oregon passed a ballot initiative called Measure 58. It was drafted with the support of an organization called Bastard Nation. The name was deliberate, a reclamation of the language used to shame the very people the sealed records were designed to contain. Measure 58 made Oregon the first state since the closures to grant adult adoptees unconditional access to their original birth certificates. The opposition was organized and loud. Adoption agencies, legal groups, and the National Council for Adoption argued that the sky would fall. Birth mothers who had been promised confidentiality would be traumatized by unwanted contact. Adoptees would show up on doorsteps. Families would be destroyed. The psychological damage would be widespread and irreversible. After court challenges delayed it, the law took effect in May 2000. None of what they predicted happened. The records were opened, people accessed them, reunions occurred. In the great majority of cases, birth parents who were found were not distressed by contact. Many had been waiting for it. What opening Oregon's records actually revealed was that the central justification for sealing them, protecting birth parents from unwanted intrusion, had been a mischaracterization of what those parents wanted. Other states followed: Alabama in 2000, New Hampshire, Maine, Rhode Island. New York, which had sealed records since 1935, the governor who signed that law was himself an adoptive father, finally passed open records legislation. An advocate who had spent decades fighting for that law described holding her own original birth certificate for the first time as overwhelming. She had waited 52 years for a piece of paper containing facts about herself. Facts that had been in a filing cabinet the entire time. But here is what the Oregon result should have done and did not do. It should have ended the argument. The evidence was in. Open records did not cause the predicted harm. The justification for sealing them had been tested and failed. The rational response was to open the records everywhere.
That did not happen. Significant restrictions remain in multiple states. Some require court orders. Some require consent from biological parents who may be dead or untraceable. Some have opened records only for future adoptions, leaving everyone adopted under the old system still locked out. The cost of navigating the confidential intermediary system in some states exceeds $875 with no refund if the search fails. When the evidence says one thing and the policy moves in the opposite direction, that is not an accident. That is a choice. There are approximately 5 million adopted Americans alive today. The U.S. Census did not record adopted children in its kinship category until the year 2000. For most of the 20th century, the scale of adoption in America was not even formally tracked by the federal government that regulated it. Of those 5 million people, a substantial number still cannot access their own original birth certificates. The medical consequences alone are significant. Adoptees who cannot access their birth records cannot access accurate family medical histories, hereditary diseases, genetic conditions, patterns of illness that run across generations, information that every non-adopted person takes for granted. Some adoptees have been denied passports for having incomplete birth certificates, documents that were made incomplete by government policy, not by any failure of their own. In Ireland, survivors of the mother and baby homes are still, in 2025, fighting for access to their own records. The special advocate appointed to assist them has stated publicly that full access to personal records is the single most frequently raised issue among survivors. Some have died before gaining access to files about themselves. In Australia, records held by the churches and non-government agencies that administered forced removals are subject to inconsistent preservation policies. The records are scattered. The cataloging is incomplete. Many people have spent years in bureaucratic systems that were constructed to process adoptions, not to help the people those adoptions were done to. There is no central registry, no unified system, no national effort anywhere to connect what was separated. DNA testing has become, in practice, the most widely used workaround. Ancestry DNA and 23andMe have allowed hundreds of thousands of adoptees and birth parents to find each other through genetic matching in ways that no sealed record law can prevent. That is not how it should work. People should not have to reverse engineer their own origins through commercial databases because governments spent 70 years building a system designed to prevent exactly that knowledge. If you were watching this because you were searching for yourself, for a biological parent, for a sibling you have never met,
Here is the clearest map I can give you of where the records actually are. In the United States, your first step is determining the current law in the state where your adoption was finalized. Oregon, Kansas, Alaska, Alabama, New Hampshire, Maine, Rhode Island, and New York now allow adult adoptees unconditional access to their original birth certificate. If your state is on that list, you can apply directly to the State Vital Records Office. If it is not, you are looking at a court order requirement, a mutual consent registry, or a confidential intermediary, none of which guarantee access, but all of which are worth attempting. The Adoption History Project at the University of Oregon holds one of the most comprehensive collections of primary documents on adoption history in the United States. Bastard Nation maintains a state-by-state guide to current adoptee rights law. The Adoptee Rights Law Center provides legal resources specifically focused on record access. The Salvation Army operated many of the maternity homes from the baby scoop era and maintains archives that may be accessible on request. Catholic Charities, which administered a significant portion of adoptions during this period, holds records that vary in accessibility by diocese. In Ireland, the Birth Information and Tracing Act of 2022 now provides adopted people with a legal right to access their birth certificates and certain identity information. The Adoption Authority of Ireland administers the process. Backlogs remain. Restrictions on certain categories of information remain subjects of ongoing advocacy. In Australia, the Find and Connect web resource provides a guide to records held by welfare organizations, religious institutions, and government agencies across every state and territory. LinkUp provides family tracing and reunion services specifically for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people affected by the Stolen Generations policies. The records are there, scattered across institutions that have no incentive to connect the dots, but they exist. I want to come back to where I started. There is a document in a government filing cabinet that records the exact facts of your birth. In many states and countries, that document is still sealed. Not because the information in it would harm you, not because the people named in it have requested protection, but because the system that sealed it was built to serve interests other than yours, and dismantling it is slow work against organized opposition that has never had to explain itself. The people who built the sealed record system called it protection. The people who maintain it today call it privacy. But when you ask protection for whom and privacy for whom, the answer has never consistently been the adoptee. The mothers who were told their relinquishment would be kept confidential were rarely told that confidentiality would be used to prevent their own children from ever finding them. The adoptees who received amended birth certificates were not told they were being handed falsified government documents in place of accurate ones. The Aboriginal children removed from their families in Australia were not told what was being done to them or why. The women imprisoned in Irish laundries were not asked whether they consented. The wall in your family tree, the point where the record goes blank, where the name changes, where the trail stops, may not be a gap in history. It might be the exact location where the law did precisely what it was designed to do, a deliberate interruption. A policy disguised as protection. The last Magdalene laundry closed in 1996. The last formal stolen generations policies were abandoned in the 1980s. The baby scoop era ended 50 years ago. The systems are largely gone, but the records those systems generated, the files that document what was done to millions of people across 4 countries, are still sealed, still controlled by institutions that have never been compelled to open them, still inaccessible to the people whose lives they record. No government has built the infrastructure needed to reconnect what was deliberately separated. No central registry, no funded reunification program, no coordinated effort to make these records accessible to the people who have spent their entire lives not knowing what is in them. The archives are still there. They still won't open, and no one in any official capacity has ever been made to explain why.
The records are there, scattered across institutions that have no incentive to connect the dots.
but they exist. I want to come back to where I started. There is a document in a government filing cabinet that records the exact facts of your birth. In many states and countries, that document is still sealed. Not because the information in it would harm you, not because the people named in it have requested protection, but because the system that sealed it was built to serve interests other than yours, and dismantling it is slow work against organized opposition that has never had to explain itself. The people who built the sealed record system called it protection. The people who maintain it today call it privacy. But when you ask protection for whom and privacy for whom, the answer has never consistently been the adoptee. The mothers who were told their relinquishment would be kept confidential were rarely told that confidentiality would be used to prevent their own children from ever finding them. The adoptees who received amended birth certificates were not told they were being handed falsified government documents in place of accurate ones. The Aboriginal children removed from their families in Australia were not told what was being done to them or why. The women imprisoned in Irish laundries were not asked whether they consented. The wall in your family tree, the point where the record goes blank, where the name changes, where the trail stops, may not be a gap in history. It may be the exact location where the law did precisely what it was designed to do. A deliberate interruption, a policy disguised as protection. The last Magdalene laundry closed in 1996. The last formal stolen generations removal policies were abandoned in the 1980s. The baby scoop era ended 50 years ago. The systems are largely gone, but the records those systems generated, the files that document what was done to millions of people across 4 countries, are still sealed, still controlled by institutions that have never been compelled to open them, still inaccessible to the people whose lives they record. No government has built the infrastructure needed to reconnect what was deliberately separated. No central registry, no funded reunification program, no coordinated effort to make these records accessible to the people who have spent their entire lives not knowing what is in them. The archives are still there. They still won't open, and no one in any official capacity has ever been made to explain why.